Hi, a very good morning and warm greetings from Singapore. It is my great pleasure and honor to deliver this address for New Directions East Asia 2021's conference on Fairer, Greener, Stronger, the Future of Language Assessment. The title of my talk today is on rethinking language teacher education and alternative assessment in post-pandemic times. Before I proceed, I'd like to remind everyone that this set of presentation slides is for presentation purposes only, as it contains copyrighted material. I will certainly make sure that I make available a copyright-free version for download for all participants. Thank you for your kind attention. COVID-19 has changed the way that we live, work, and learn overnight and forever. We have experienced worldwide disruptions caused not least by the fourth industrial revolution as well as the current pandemic that we are still battling. According to an estimate by McKinsey & Co., there are more than 800 million jobs displaced and to date about 254 million people infected worldwide. What has COVID-19 revealed about our education systems? One, that we are not yet prepared enough for the multiple disruptions that we face. Two, that we're not as robust or resilient as we think we are. And thirdly, that a lot of inequity and inequality in our various jurisdictions have been exposed. I'd like to quote from our Minister for Education from July 2020 to May 2021, Mr. Lawrence Wong, who has this to say about seizing opportunities amid disruptions. And I quote, "In the midst of crisis, we are seizing opportunities to reshape our education system for the longer term and to accelerate improvements in the way we teach and learn." Unquote. It is extremely important that each and every one of us turns opportunities amidst disruptions that we face during the pandemic. Should we seize opportunities amid disruptions? Firstly, our systems need to strengthen the foundations that have already worked for us and to continuously build on them to make them even stronger. Secondly, we need to seize the opportunity and the chance to rethink our systems and make them more resilient, nimble, and innovative in order to cope with the current crisis and beyond. Thirdly, the rethinking of our education systems must be contextualized with a deep understanding of what works for each and every one of our systems. I'd also like to share Singapore's vision for teacher education in the broader context of dealing with the crisis and even before. Our ethos of teacher education is values-driven, as you can see from the three-pronged set of values that is embedded in the diagram on the left. And the three value paradigms are: value one, learner-centeredness, that at the center of everything we do lies the learner at the heart of all our educational endeavors. Secondly, our second value proposition is about a strong sense of teacher identity, because international research literature has shown us that those teachers who are proud of becoming teachers are likely to A, stay longer in the profession, and B, contribute back to growing the next generation of teachers. Thirdly, the third value paradigm is about service to the community and profession. It is about stewardship and mentorship and growing the next generation of teachers, even as we ourselves become professional teachers. And wrapped around this three-pronged set of values are 21st century skills and knowledge that are deemed necessary for our teachers to not just survive, but thrive in the 21st century and beyond. We want our graduates of our teacher education programs to be creators of knowledge, not merely consumers, to be facilitators of learning, not merely transmitters, to be architects who build and dream the learning environments that they'd like their students to belong to and not merely implement what's given. We want them to be shapers of characters, not merely participants. And we finally want them to be leaders of educational change not merely followers. Singapore's vision for teacher education is a for-life model which plays on the word for, as in F-O-U-R or F-O-R, for life. First, we aim to provide lifelong teacher education, by which we mean providing multiple pathways across the continuum of a teacher's career-long growth and development from pre-service to beginning to professional teaching. Secondly, we also aim to provide life-wise teacher education, by which we mean building a strong sense of professionalism through building the ethos and values of each and every teacher that goes through our system via strengthening our values-based components of our program, including the provision of strong and personalized mentorship throughout a teacher's career. Thirdly, it is also about deepening of the professional expertise of our teachers through our pre-service programs such as the Digital Professional Inquiry Portfolio and the Singapore Teaching Practice, for example. Finally, we also aim to provide life-wide teacher education, by which we mean providing multiple perspectives, both global and local, opportunities for our student teachers to experience education in a local as well as in a global context, and through engaging them in multimodal digital and multimodal literacies. Here you see the Future Ready wheel, which envisions future-ready teachers for future-ready learners. Let me try to explain elements of this wheel. We begin with teacher professionalism, which I've spoken about in the last slide. This involves building a strong sense of teacher ethos and through strengthening and providing a wide range of values-based education programs within our pre-service offerings. Secondly, you see the provision of rigorous programs during pre-service and beyond. This involves providing a strong theory-practice nexus within our programs and providing our student teachers with a deep understanding of learners and their learning styles, to name a few. Thirdly, it is about innovative pedagogies. We all understand that what is innovative today will become irrelevant tomorrow. However, we can break this down very roughly into providing inquiry-based, authentic, experiential, self-directed, and technology-enhanced pedagogies for our student teachers. Next, we also aim to provide a strong multiple perspective lens for our student teachers through various components such as character and citizenship education programs, the involvement of each and every one of our student teachers in a community involvement project known as Group Endeavors in Service Learning, internship opportunities, both locally and abroad, as well as service opportunities abroad, and the very important international practicum stints and semester exchange abroad. Finally, we also believe in building the deep professional practice of our teachers through the digital portfolio, known as the Professional Practice and Inquiry Portfolio, and through multiple clinical practice stints in schools in partnership with our schools. I would now like to focus our attention not just on teacher education, but on English language teacher preparation or education. Here, we've articulated what we mean by critical competencies of the language teacher. We first have subject matter knowledge, followed by pedagogical content knowledge, as well as knowledge of context, or what we call professional preparation. Let me begin by trying to expound each and every one of these critical competencies. First, I begin with subject matter knowledge. Within subject matter knowledge, we need to imbue our student teachers with pedagogically relevant applied linguistics, like linguistics in the classroom, language teaching, theories and practice, for example, education in context. These are some examples of applied linguistics fields that are pedagogically relevant for the future English language teacher. Next, we move on to sociolinguistic competence. Our student teachers need to know appropriately when to communicate with who, why, and in what context. Next, we also need to teach our students strategic or pragmatic competence. What should we say in which context, and why is it appropriate or why is it not? We also need to focus on school-relevant subject matter knowledge, for example, pedagogical grammar that is useful and relevant for their application in their language classrooms of the future. We also need the traditional grammatical linguistic competence of key areas in syntax, in phonetics and phonology, for example, and in semantics. Finally, our student teachers will need to know discoursal competence, issues of coherence and cohesion in speech and in writing. I now move on to talk about pedagogical knowledge. Pedagogical content knowledge would be the methodological know-how of how to teach the English language in new modalities to engage a range of profiles of students, for example. Finally, knowledge of context involves communication skills for teachers, academic discourse skills, but also very practical skills, for example, the 4 school-based clinical practice stints that we have for each and every one of our student teachers in schools. I'd now like to talk about some challenges that confront the English language teacher in the context of multicultural Singapore. I'd like to talk about 2 principles that add to these challenges. They are the nativeness principle as well as the intelligibility principle. To those who ascribe to the nativeness principle, scholars such as Lenneberg and Scoville have this to comment about the nativeness principle, that it places unnecessary burden on both teachers and learners, and that frankly, it can only be achieved when the language is learned before the child reaches adulthood. In a monograph that I wrote in 2015, I advocate that non-native and native speakers both have the duty to accommodate their accents to communicate, both in intra and international settings. I also advocate that we need to ask ourselves the question about whose native accent are we trying to veer towards. Perhaps it is the non-native accent that native speakers need to accommodate towards in a global world that we face today. In terms of the intelligibility principle, we all need to rise up to the challenge of being able to teach the features that promote international intelligibility or understanding, and not to focus on features that are least helpful in achieving this aim. In my monograph, I further expound that in the context of multilingual and multicultural uses of English, this results in the need for us to respect not just one norm or a single norm, but pluricentric norms that must inform the context within which we work as language teachers and in the field of language teaching and language learning. Many years ago, when I had the privilege of attending TESOL convention in Boston, perhaps in the year 2008 or 2009, I remember that Professor Howard Gardner of Harvard Graduate School of Education shared about his 5 minds for the future. It set me thinking deeply about how the 5 minds framework can be applied to the language teacher. In this respect, I have developed Howard Gardner's 5 minds to add 2 more minds. 5 plus 2 minds equals 7 minds for the future-ready language teacher in today's context, especially in the pandemic and post-pandemic times within which each and every one of us is working today. I will spend the next few minutes talking about the 7 minds vis-a-vis a disciplined mind, a synthesizing mind, a creating mind, a respectful mind, an ethical mind, a digitally literate and savvy mind, and an adaptive and solutioning mind. Let me first begin by talking about the disciplined mind. Howard Gardner in 2008 has this to say about the disciplined mind, and I quote, employing the ways of thinking associated with major scholarly disciplines and major professions capable of applying oneself diligently, improving steadily, and continuing beyond formal education. Unquote. What does this mind mean for the language teacher? Language teachers therefore need to be competent in teaching subject matter knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and knowledge of context, meaning the professional context within which they work. I've already emphasized on each of these critical competencies in an earlier slide, and we can now call this the disciplined mind as defined by Howard Gardner for the language teacher. I will now move on to talk about the synthesizing mind. According to Gardner, it is the ability to select crucial information from copious amounts available, arraying that information in ways that make sense to ourselves and to others. Unquote. What does this mean for the language teacher? Language teachers need to keep abreast of what's the latest available technology, software, and developments in language teaching and be able critically to sift out the good from the bad. This is extremely important as we strive to keep ahead of latest research in our areas. The third mind that I'd like to focus on is a creating mind. And what does this mean? I quote, "It goes beyond existing knowledge and synthesis to pose new questions, offer new solutions, fashion works that stretch existing genres or configure new ones. Creation builds on one or more established disciplines and requires an informed field to make judgments of quality and acceptability." Unquote. In terms of language teachers, we need to be willing to create and innovate our teaching methods and resources based on all that our disciplined and synthesizing minds have given us. For example, we can venture on an exciting, creative, innovative exercise of creating our own interactive digital media game to engage our learners to be able to learn language or the sounds of language in an engaging way on a digital platform. The next mind that Gardner talks about is a respectful mind, and I quote, "responding sympathetically and constructively to differences among individuals and among groups, seeking to understand and work with those who are different, extending beyond mere tolerance and political correctness." Unquote. What does that mean for the language teacher? Language teachers need to always expose students to different varieties for world Englishes and encourage them to think about the socio-cultural dimensions that these varieties bring and the identities that they portray. We need to move them away from thinking about an ideal monocentric model and to embrace pluricentric norms that I've spoken about earlier on. Gardner's fifth mind is about having an ethical mind, which he describes as, I quote, "abstracting crucial features of one's role at work and one's role as a citizen, and acting consistently with those conceptualizations, striving towards good work and good citizenship." Unquote. Language teachers need to always be reminded that the hallmark of a good teacher is ultimately to possess technical excellence in their fields, underpinned by strong ethics, and that the ultimate goal of our teaching is student engagement and helping them to continue learning on their own. What about the other two minds? I would like to propose a sixth mind, which is a digitally literate and savvy mind for the future-ready language teacher. By this, I mean that language teachers need to be digitally literate and savvy in order to connect with their students who are very likely to be digital natives. They also need to transform their teaching by using digital platforms and keep learning going in any time during crisis or worldwide disruptions. The seventh mind that I'd like to talk about is an adaptive and solutioning mind. What do I mean? By being adaptive, language teachers have to adapt to the new normal of keeping teaching going even in the midst of school closures. A solutioning mind. Language teachers have to work within the constraints of virtual online classrooms, closed schools, and closed international borders. What about alternative assessments for the language teacher? Here, I'd like to talk about some characteristics of alternative assessment, which may be defined as proximity to actual language use and performance, that which is based on activities with authentic communicative function which learners are likely to encounter in their daily lives. It embraces a holistic view of language where the interrelationships among various aspects of language, for example, phonology, grammar, and vocabulary, are taken into account. It also looks into the holistic nature of the four language skills, that is, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, which are considered components of a structurally integrated whole. Authentic assessment also embraces an integrative view of learning that aims to elicit the whole range of a learner's skills and capacities and competencies. It is important to test linguistic proficiency in the context of a wider and specific subject matter or discipline rather than in isolation. We need questions that pertain to school-age pupils that may focus on their capacity to comprehend information in scientific or social studies, for example. And for the adult learner, it is important for them to be able to hold a conversation in a business setting, which may be assessed. Authentic assessments must also be developmentally appropriate. That is, we must set expectations that are appropriate within our learners' cognitive, social, and academic development trajectories. Next, there must be multiple referencing, which entails obtaining information about learners from various sources and through numerous means. I'd now like to talk about alternative assessments in the post-pandemic era, and here I'm citing literature that's relevant and place the source beneath each slide for you to look up in case you're interested. Alternative assessments include the ability to have very good diagnostic formative assessments to inform us about how our students are learning in remote environments, for example. We need to have both short and long assignment-based evaluations, project-based evaluations, performance-based evaluations that are, for example, presentations based on participation, even in an online platform, and the production of real archetypes that can give us a snapshot of their learning. It may even involve parents' or guardians' evaluations of the learning of their child at home. There are multiple changes in the modes of assessment in the post-pandemic era and beyond. For example, whilst in the past synchronous and physical examinations were the order of the day, we are now moving into platforms of asynchronous and virtual assessments. So we're moving from face-to-face examinations to more open book exams or non-timed or asynchronous assignments. We are moving away from face-to-face presentations to online presentations, whether individually or as a group. We are moving away from practical examinations to more written assignments, moving away from real-time synchronous spoken competence assessments to more asynchronous pre-recorded virtual spoken assessment competence assessments, for example. Along with these changes in the modes of our assessments in the pandemic era and beyond are the changes in the implementation platforms, which are mainly asynchronous. We see assessment taking place through Google Classrooms, Google Forms, even emails. We see the use of personal websites and blogs and other social media platforms that can be used as forms of alternative and authentic assessment of our students' learning. We see a range of online quizzes administered through Kahoot, for example, and online polls about students' opinions through Mentimeter, for instance. As language teachers, we need to be cognizant that indeed there are many advantages of alternative assessments, such as the availability to conduct the tests on demand at any time at all, the use of a computerized system that can provide direct feedback through the use of data analytics to our users, the immediate input of student test scores in electronic class books, which then reduces the rate of errors in marks entry, for example, students' faster access to the results of their tests, and the provision of more student-centered learning environments that do not make them nervous because they have to memorize information, but be able to have open book settings and asynchronous settings where they do not need to be confined to a timed examination environment. As a result, the advantage of alternative assessments would be perhaps a more accurate measurement of their learning, giving us as language educators insights about their needs as learners. However, we must note that students with low information technology skills or indeed a lack of access to information technology might very likely be heavily disadvantaged. Having shared with you about the alternative assessments that can take place in pandemic and post-pandemic times, I'd like to share a real case study and lived example of Singapore's approach for language teacher education in responding to COVID-19 in the past year. First of all, we had to have 100% online and virtual platforms for teaching, learning, and assessing during the circuit breaker period, or what Singapore calls our lockdown period, from April to May of 2020. When circuit breaker struck, I had 344 student teachers out on the final teaching practicum. I needed to revamp the teaching practicum component urgently to ensure the enactment of virtual lessons and eventually the assessment of virtual lessons, which becomes an important competence of all language teachers. I've already mentioned the mixed modality final practicum to be flexible to allow our student teachers to be accredited based on both a 55% virtual face-to-face practicum as well as a 45% virtual home-based learning environment of enactment. Fourthly, I've had to use virtual platforms to engage relevant partner organizations for language learning exposure for my student teachers. Fifthly, I had to work with my international partners to enact virtual international semester abroad in the midst of multiple border closures. Finally, we were able to envisage collectively with our teacher educators how the future-ready, collaborative, and virtually open classroom of the future might look like, and the core and critical capabilities of these classrooms of the future. This is a work in progress, which I'll be happy to report about in another lecture in the future. I'd now like to make some concluding remarks about the role of all educators in pandemic times, as I managed to reflect long and hard in the numerous lockdowns that we've had, both as a nation and globally in the past year. To me, the role of all educators in pandemic times is to keep learning going, no matter when, no matter what, and no matter how. And this speaks of the essential role that all educators have had to play as essential workers along with healthcare workers in the recent pandemic. Extending this to what universities need in pandemic times and beyond, I'd like to quote from the president of the National University of Singapore, Professor Tan Chai, who had this to say on the 10th of September 2020 in a Straits Times opinion article. The pandemic is more than a medical issue. It has ramifications on our society, politics, economy, and our local and global environment. In the past, we have always embraced specialization and depth of knowledge as a core feature of university education. In the future, we really need to move into interdisciplinarity, flexibility, and lifelong learning. And the type of faculty that we need for the future would be those that possess the depth and breadth of knowledge, who are agile, who are solvers of wicked problems that are ill-defined, mutating, and that transcend disciplinary boundaries and establish bodies of knowledge, such as the pandemic that we are battling currently. To end, I'd like to play a video tribute that was recorded as part of a Teachers' Day video for all our local teachers in 2020 for all the hard work and dedication that they've done to keep learning going no matter when, no matter how, and no matter what. To this end, I'd like to salute all educators, language educators, for the hard work that you've done as essential workers to keep learning going in pandemic times and beyond. Thank you for all the work that you do as educators, placing the learner at the heart of all your educational endeavors.